I'd like to welcome you to the second day of our conference. Thank you all for attending. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce the lineup for day two. Before I do that, I'd like to remind you all that there is a Next Steps workshop tomorrow on Saturday. If you are able and interested in attending, please make sure that you have registered at the bottom of the online program if you intend to come to that session tomorrow. Today we will be starting off with session 4, regulatory and reimbursement considerations in clinical translation of spinal cord stimulation, and Rob Wudlick will be chairing that session. We will then transition to session 5, combination therapy to enhance spinal cord stimulation, and that will be chaired by Igor Lavrov. And we will then move to our Next Steps panel and finish our day. Before we start, and I hand the mic over to Rob, I'd really like to acknowledge Rob's contribution, really as co-chair and organizer of this symposium. Rob has brought tremendous energy, enthusiasm, expertise, and guidance, and I think that the content of this conference would not really be of the quality that it is without Rob's contribution. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you everyone for coming, and I really hope that this is you're going to walk away from this meeting with a lot of takeaways and things to bring back to your groups, and so we can get this going. So my journey really, I didn't set out to enter healthcare. I was an expert mountaineer. I grew up here. I loved sailing, skiing, and I broke my neck in 2011 rafting down the Grand Canyon from a shallow diving accident. And I was a very happy person, very active before my injury, and I did bounce back, and I'm still pretty happy. But really, I have this injury in the middle here that is with me every day. And I wake up, I went to bed at midnight last night, finishing my slide deck, and woke up at 5:30 and was worried I wasn't going to make it here on time. So, and that's just a little part of, the SCI experience. So, a little bit, I, go back. Can you go back? So, takeaways really are, time is kind of the biggest thing that scares me. Losing out on time, and I've lost a lot of opportunity of life. It takes me longer to do everything, and everything. It's not easy. So that's kind of my currency. And when we look at the medical devices and translation, we can do better. These values that, from basic science to clinical, implementation and kind of getting it commercialized, and there's a lot of gaps, and we all know that there's valleys of death, but there's ways that we can work together better. And so how do we minimize and shorten these? There's a lot of complaints about the system in place, and really that system's built off of vast amount of history, mistakes that were made in the past, lessons learned. Sometimes we're a little overcautious, but I think there's always room for continuous improvement. So, and a month ago, I was at a conference and I heard this kind of description about regulatory, and everything's a game, and we're solving problems. And when you're playing games, and so if you look at regulatory and translation as like a chess game, you can throw the board out and try to get everyone to play your own game, or you can become a chess master. So that's, and there's always room to modify the games, or the rules, but, and really, so we're all playing different games, though. That's part of the problem. And, in academic, you might be playing Sudoku, and, regulatory is, a whole different thing, and I probably should have switched chess with Monopoly over in industry, but, some people are out sailing, it's different sports, and we really, can't become a master of all, but we can become experts in our own field. And we really, most people here are experts or want to be an expert, and we all want to do good, but we don't know the other games. We can't master every game on the book, because then you just wouldn't have time to be good at your own thing. And we also get conditioned to kind of our own environments, so. And a lot of things that I've seen, and this is just kind of my observations, what do different people care about? Like, as a patient, I care about, getting a safe, functional improvement and improving my quality of life. I don't really care a whole lot about the mechanism of action, or, as long as it's paid for or affordable, like, that's what matters to me. But really, I just want to get better, and I don't want to end up in a worse spot. Academics, they apply for grants. A lot of that's, how does this work? And it doesn't work when you write a grant saying that, I want to get, this commercialized. It does sometimes, but it's very hard. As an academic professional, you all know the game of, like, discovery, and that's really the sandbox that you're playing in. Clinicians have a whole different objective, healthcare systems, industry, payers, so on. In 2029, we're almost due for another NIH conference. But, silos of different academic institutions was the big theme. And we've done a lot better. Now we're kind of like have this grain mill, and we all kind of contribute our science together with open data commons, but there's so many more silos in the distance. And, FDA, CMS, like, we need to think about reimbursement down the road with our outcome measures early on. And so it's important. So, and part of the thing too, if we don't exactly know all the rules of the game, we heard the other day, regulation or laws, guidance is recommendations. So, there's unknown hazards. We don't know how hard it is. We don't know when we're going to succeed or fail, but we do know that there's collaborative communities, which you'll hear about soon. I hope we can get that going right after this conference, and, building better outcome measures, and, learning rules of the game. Later, you'll hear about a really interesting presentation from one of our doctors here in Minnesota that is implanting people and getting reimbursement for spinal cord stimulation for spinal cord injury, except for an off-label use. And is she, the Magnus of the chess world, or, I don't know. And, we can't all be Will Shorts, but Will Shorts didn't invent, Dungeons and Dragons, and it wouldn't be appropriate to come to Minnesota without hearing about Jesse Ventura. There are some masters that, Navy SEAL, pro wrestler, actor, governor. Now, I'm not going to say what he's doing now, but yeah. But yeah, it's some people just kind of master of all or something, but yeah. Again, I think we only get the answers to the questions we ask. My friend Jenny is event-dependent quadriplegic. We don't do enough research for the people that need it most. She's in a lot worse position than I am, and not being able to use my shoulders, I've lost all of my independence. I believe I'm at war with this injury every day. And so, forward and on, time is life. So don't lose sight of your goals and keep asking questions and asking your own assumptions. Yeah. So we have a great panel. I'm glad that Heather is going to go first, and then Kai, who's going to talk about a very interesting new kind of development in the FDA. We have Lynn talking about reimbursement, and Arushi, who's kind of our professional commentator, observer, and she's part of the system too. But I'm really excited for this panel, so thank you.
Okay, so one of the advantages to speaking on the third day of this meeting is that I've gotten to see what topics have bubbled up. The thing is, I'm trying to then put it all together in 15 minutes. Maybe I can do 17. This is going to be a bit of a tour de force, but I can make these slides public. There are quite a few links to guidance documents and additional information. And also, if it's not shared through this meeting, feel free to email me and I'll send you the slides. So first, to demystify FDA a little bit. So there are several centers. I'm in the Center for Devices in Radiological Health, CDRH. Within CDRH, we have what we call a super office, the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality. Within that super office, OPEC, we have several OHTs, Office of Health Technologies. These are divided up into the various product spaces. I'm in OHT 5, the Office of Neurological and Physical Medicine Devices, and that's led by Dr. David McMullen, our office director. There are two divisions. I'm not really going to cover much of Division A. I'm going to focus really on Division B. That's the one that you would be most likely to interact with. So that's led by our division director, Dr. Vivek Pinto, and there are 4 teams. 2 of those are really focused on neuromodulation devices, one for neurology and one for psychiatric indications. There are 2 physical medicine teams, so I lead one of those. Our names are not as descriptive as they could be. My team is really assistive devices. So my team, we have 15 people. We cover every single wheelchair that's sold in the US. We cover powered exoskeleton devices, advanced prosthetic devices, anything assistive. That includes brain-computer interface devices for communication or movement. It also includes the spinal cord stimulators for some spinal cord injury studies, mostly those that are focused on the acute effects. If you are aiming more at a more therapeutic effect, that's going to go to my colleague Amber. Her team really covers therapeutic devices. So think anything that heats or cools, from ice or hot packs to shortwave diathermy devices, spinal cord stimulators for pain, and anything that's meant for long-term therapy. If you write to me and you're not sure which team your device would be reviewed in, I will put you in touch with the right people. So feel free to reach out even if you're not quite sure which team. So very quickly, a little bit about regulatory oversight, because I know that's kind of what was expected here. I'm kind of minimizing this to talk about other things. Many of you know we classify devices into 3 risk categories, 1, 2, and 3. And these different categories require different types of submissions or different controls to make sure that they are safe and effective. So class 3 devices would include the implanted spinal cord stimulators, and we have a lot more oversight over those than, say, the transcutaneous stimulators that would be class 2. So the different submission types, you've heard, I think, about Q submissions. There are quite a few things that fall under Q submissions. I'll go into that. IDEs, investigational device exemptions, these are required if you're going to conduct a significant risk study. And we determined if something is significant risk or not. I'll talk about how you can ask us if your device or your study would be significant risk. If you're not sure how a device would be regulated, if it would require a PMA, a de novo, or might fall under one of our existing regulations, you can put in a 513G request for designation. So once a study is completed and you're going for marketing, Again, the submission type is going to depend on the risk, with a PMA or pre-marketing application for the highest risk devices, de novo for those that are lower risk but for which we don't have a regulation yet, 510Ks for those for which there is a regulation. And we have some other paths to market, such as humanitarian device exemptions, but I'm not going to go into that for groups where there are a small number of patients. So Q submissions, we call them these because in our file naming conventions, the name will start with a Q and then a number for the year, followed by 4 digits. That's the unique identifier altogether for that particular submission. And Q submissions are a number of different forms, including informational meetings. These are your opportunities to come just talk to us about your device, your study, your entire regulatory strategy, whatever it is you want to present to FDA, we will set up a meeting. It's not your chance to ask us questions, but we will ask you questions. You can get a lot of information from what we ask. And we're also a very helpful bunch. Generally, when someone comes to us with an informational meeting, we'll follow up with various guidance documents that we think might be of use given your presentation. I mentioned the pre-submissions prior to a study where you can ask questions. More on that in the next slide. Study risk determinations. IRBs often make this initial determination, but FDA has the final say. If your IRB isn't sure, or if you want to make sure that you are following the rules, that you're coming to us for an IDE if needed, then you can ask us how we would consider that study. And it depends on the study, not the device. We do not make risk determinations about a device, a study device. I think that's a common misconception. You can have an app on the phone, but if your study involves taking away medication from patients that are suicidal to, say, study an app for depression, we would likely consider that to be significant risk. It depends on the risk to the patients of the study. Breakthrough designation requests. It's a newer program I'm going to cover in more detail later. So these pre-submissions, so you heard yesterday from Susan Albert that we like them to be focused. I think our guidance document says that we want no more than 4 topics. Please don't play 20 questions. You can put in as many pre-submissions as you like, but we don't want to overwhelm a reviewer and a review team with a single pre-sub. Investigational device exemptions. There are several different types of studies. I think you've heard people mention early feasibility studies and pivotal trials. Not every device development is going to go through every single one of these stages, but these are some common stages. So an early feasibility study, we expect that a device is still being updated. Many of the BCI devices, for example, brain-computer interface devices, you might have an implant that then the data is being amplified by different amplifiers and then the data analyzed with different computers and different end effectors used. We're not going to require, as we would for a marketing submission, the electromagnetic compatibility testing for that whole system, as that's going to change on a regular basis. We realize that, and that would be burdensome to require all the testing. What we are going to look at is how are you mitigating the risk and keeping patients safe. With a small number of patients, you can do quite a bit of risk mitigation. Traditional feasibility study, that's intended to help you gather information that will help you design that pivotal trial. You might be testing out blinding procedures. You might be kind of figuring out the power that you can expect in your pivotal trial. And the pivotal trial is intended for you to be able to collect the data that will support the future marketing submission. So what do we look for in a study? We can look at a number of things, and it really depends. If you're using an already marketed device, we'll already have a lot of information on the safety of the device, and we can focus on the clinical. If you have a new device, we might need to understand the hermeticity, we might need to understand the details of the biocompatibility for an implant, the validation of your sterilization, that kind of thing. So we're going to look at a number of things. I link here to our guidance document for BCI devices, but I think there's a lot of overlap in the considerations for BCIs and stimulators. We look at a number of things that are clinical. So every team, I think in our division at least, has at least 2 clinicians, and they are experts at going through protocols. and informed consent forms. And they'll also look at how are you recording the data? Do you have what you need in those case report forms? We're going to look at the labeling. And even if it's a marketed device, these need to be labeled as investigational, because in an IDE, by definition, you're using a device for a new intended use, new patient population, that kind of thing. We're also going to look at, are the investigators qualified? Do we trust them to make sure that the patients are going to be kept safe? We'll need all this information in an IDE submission. When we look at the protocol, there's a lot that we look at. I'm not going to cover everything here. Again, I'll hand out the slides. We're going to look at the number of subjects. If we have safety concerns, we might ask that a study be staged, that we get 6-month safety data for the first 2 or 3 subjects before the study is expanded. We're going to look at, is the patient population appropriate? Does it make sense given the indication? And how are you going to make sure that they are safe in this? We're going to look at the endpoints. So while our focus at the IDE stage is on patient safety, if we think a study is not unlikely to give you any useful data, then it might not be worth any risk. And so that could be reason to disapprove a study. So we're really going to look at, do we think that this is going to give you what you need? If we think the study is going to be useful, but there are still considerations that would make this better for what you want to do for supporting a future study, we will give you study design considerations. And those are recommendations, but I highly recommend that you take a close look. We have fantastic experts at FDA. We have whole teams of wonderful statisticians. We have these very experienced clinicians and scientists and engineers. So please pay attention. When we send things, we do highly recommend that you pay attention. We're going to look at what are the caregiver instructions and training, especially with IDEs moving to home use? How are you making sure that wounds are going to be taken care of? We're going to look at all the risks and your mitigation plans. We're going to want you to have thought through all of the risks. If it's not clear that you've thought about a risk, we're going to bring it up. So it's better if you really think through these and have a mitigation in place. How are you going to report your adverse events? How are you defining those? Informed consent. We want to make sure the patients are fully informed. What are the risks? This is an investigational device. What are their other options? What are the costs? What happens at the end of the study? We've heard over and over again that losing a device at the end of the study, losing access to the benefit, can be another loss for patients. What are you doing to make sure that patients are aware of their options? If they choose to keep an implant, for example, who's responsible if 5 years after the study ends that there's an infection and the device needs to be explanted? You need to think through what patients need to know, and we'll make sure that we're checking for all of that. I know there's been a real focus on the patient story and patient perspective. We have guidance for using patient-reported outcome measures. I'm not going to say much here, just link to the guidance document. Also, we really care about patient preference. Real-world evidence. I've heard quite a few people bring up real-world evidence for marketing submissions, and it is something that we take seriously. It is important to have information. The best data we can get for a marketing submission will be clinical data, and preferably something that is a randomized controlled trial. You don't get that from real-world data, but there can be a lot more data from things like registries. So we do have guidance on how you might make use of that. Here are some neurospecific resources. I encourage you to follow these links and check them out, including that BCI guidance document that I mentioned. So very quickly, special programs. So I've mentioned again and again this collaborative community. And this is on my mind because this Wednesday was the very first meeting for the implanted BCI collaborative community. And I see a lot of the same questions bubbling up here as have been bubbling up there. So questions like, what are the right outcome assessments? And how can we agree on terminology? I've heard disagreements on what these various terms that are used mean. What are the right standards? What are the right safety parameters? What are the right stimulation parameters for safety and effectiveness? These are things that require a diverse group of stakeholders to come together and agree on. And a collaborative community brings together the patients, the various device makers, the researchers, clinicians, funders, and you can invite FDA to be part of it as well, and it's our chance to listen in and on any regulatory questions. Medical device development tools. I mentioned these as well at various times. So if you have a great new way to assess how safe and effective these devices are, and you want to validate that as a measure, you can come to us, propose this as an MDDT, and we will work with you to validate that. And once it's validated, then that's something that FDA can trust. If you come to us with a study that uses this particular tool. And finally, the Breakthrough Devices Program. So this enables faster interactions with FDA. For a pre-submission, traditionally, we get written feedback to you by day 70, or at least 5 days before a meeting, if that's scheduled before day 75. That is required for us, but it can be a long time for you. And a breakthrough status gives you access to faster interactions as resources allow. And like I said, I have a team. We're 15 in total. We have a lot coming at us. But if we can, with sprint discussions, by day 70, we will have had a couple of meetings and back and forth to help you, say, finalize your protocol. It's a great program. And now we have as well this TPLC advisory program, or TAP, which Kai is going to tell you about a little bit more. But it really comes from the fact that we are situated at a really critical point for device makers. This is a time when device makers need to be thinking ahead about not just the regulatory hurdles, but the payer side of things, and also patient adoption, right? How do we make sure that the time that we're spending at FDA getting you through the regulatory process is going to be well spent, that will allow this to get to patients and actually make a difference? So this is something I've been very excited about, and I know Kai will be excited to tell you more about that. You can reach out to me anytime. I do set up a chance to chat with anyone who reaches out to me and asks for it. Happy to talk regulatory strategy. And as I said, I can put you in touch with my colleagues if they are more appropriate. And with that, I will end and turn it over to Kai.
Heather, as we're transitioning, I saw lots of people furiously scribbling and taking pictures. So I just want to reassure the audience that your slide deck will be available and accessible, because there is so much information in what you just presented.
Okay, excuse me. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak today about the TAP program. I'm thrilled to be here. It's been an excellent discussion over these few days here. So just by way of introduction, I'm Kai Kadoich, and I am not a smart guy, okay? I don't have a PhD like Heather. I don't have scientific experience. I'm not an engineer. I'm not even a regulatory expert. But I do work at the FDA, believe it or not. Excuse me. So what I've done is I've worked in the medical device industry for 15 years. I started as a consultant advising medical device and pharmaceutical companies on their strategic decision-making, market entry strategy, portfolio decision-making, competitive strategy. Then I moved to Medtronic, where I worked for over a decade. And at Medtronic, I worked in strategy. I worked in business development, where I worked with small companies with innovative medical technologies on partnerships, licenses, co-development, investments, M&A, those kinds of things. And I did that in neuromodulation, actually, for about 4 years. Other things I did at Medtronic were marketing. And in medical devices, marketing is the team that's responsible for getting the device to the market. So I launched new therapies. I launched Medtronic's first transcatheter aortic valve. I was responsible for large, mature portfolios like spinal cord stimulator and a balloon kyphoplasty. And I managed products all the way down to a $10 cannula for a nerve ablation system. So, I'm really honored to be working at the FDA, where I can take all of my previous experiences and I can apply them to the most critical challenges that we're facing in the medical device industry today. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. So, as Heather showed this earlier, this is a conceptualization of the medical device product development lifecycle from conceptualization to broad commercialization and patient adoption. And the key challenge with medical devices actually is that not all the devices actually make it to the end of this process. And in fact, the vast majority of medical devices which are developed don't make it to the end of the process. Various numbers are thrown around, but it's widely said that 10 to 20% of devices which are developed even get to the point of FDA approval or an FDA marketing authorization. And then something like 10% of devices get to the point of being broadly adopted by patients after FDA authorization. And this isn't good, right? This isn't good for businesses, for entrepreneurs and inventors who want to build businesses. This isn't good for FDA, as Heather said, spending all this time and energy getting devices, working with companies to get devices approved that don't make it to patients. And most importantly, it's not good for patients, right? That's why we're all here to accelerate access to innovation for patients. And so, a lot of companies are focused on the FDA marketing authorization. I work with early stage entrepreneurs, early stage companies, and everyone's laser focused on FDA marketing approval, which is obviously super important. It's the most important first step, but it's just not the only step. And after FDA approval, there's a whole slew of challenges, and it's a period that's known as the medical device valley of death. We talked about that earlier as well. And there's numerous challenges that are waiting for technologies that, in that period between approval and broad patient access. They could be reimbursement. That comes up a lot. That's probably the most critical challenge that companies are facing today. It could be related to clinical practice, and changes that are required to clinical practice in order to adopt a technology. Could be related to patient acceptance of a new therapy or technology that wasn't considered earlier in the process, or referral pathways, or different acceptance and use of different physician specialties. There's a slew of potential challenges out there for new technologies, unfortunately. And as you see, that leads to additional time, right? Time is the most valuable thing we have. Additional time it takes to get to patients, late failures, additional money spent that wasn't anticipated, need to raise additional capital for these companies. And on some, a lot of them just don't make it. So that's the idea behind this TAP program is, what more can FDA do to help support innovative technology ultimately get to patients? And I'll talk through the program specifics, but the idea is at an early stage, in that pre-market stage, how can we help companies not avoid that medical device valley of death, but get a better idea of what's coming down the pike? Every single company is different. Every single situation is different. But by helping companies think through that plan and get input from different stakeholders across the medical device ecosystem that are going to be critical for the successful adoption of a device, we think that we can ultimately serve FDA's public health mission of safe, effective devices, patients getting access to that, and support the U.S. population in that way. So who can join the TAP program? Well, there's a few criteria. The key criteria is a breakthrough device designation, and Heather went through that earlier, an innovative device in a high needs area. And now today, for the devices that are qualify, after the breakthrough designation is granted, the company gets automatically an email from FDA saying, have you heard about TAP program? You should consider it. There are a few other requirements. It has to be early in the development stage. So, for instance, a company cannot have already started a pivotal study, for instance. And then there are a few other criteria. Can't be a drug-device combination and whatnot. And this program, it's ramping up over a 5-year period, but it'll expand to all the different review offices of the FDA that Heather showed you. But right now, it's only in the cardiology and the neuro and physical medicine areas, which SCI devices are typically in, fortunately. So what is the TAP program and how it works? I love this slide as an ex-consultant. It gives you a good idea here. I'll start in the middle. The middle is the TAP advisor, and that's what I am. And it's a new role at the FDA. Heather showed you a lot of the organization around the OPEC super organization, and that's where the reviewers sit. I don't sit in that organization. I sit under the center director, who's like the president of the device area of the FDA. And I have a different job. I work hand in hand with reviewers, but my role is all day, all the time, day and night. All I do is think about how do I work with the companies that I'm assigned to help them accelerate their path to getting to patients, be it regulatory approval or the things thereafter. That's all I do all day. It's kind of a concierge model. So once a company is assigned, is admitted to the TAP program, they get assigned a TAP advisor, and then I work with them very closely. I'm there to provide an excellent customer service experience and help them utilize our service lines basically through this TAP program. So the two parts of the triangle, other parts of the triangle you'll see there are the service lines, if you will. One is the FDA interaction side, and so Heather talked through the Q-Sub program and the Breakthrough Device program and how there are options for early interaction with FDA. The TAP program kind of puts those on steroids, basically, and it offers new mechanisms to interact with the FDA review teams and all the subject matter experts and consultants within there. Everything from informal, regular touch-based meetings where we can have open and transparent, interactive discussions around strategic decision-making and identifying risk, to more formal mechanisms, 14-day teleconference, 40-day written feedback versus a 70-day time clock in the normal Q-Sub process. Again, the whole idea is to break down those barriers, to have more speedy and open, transparent engagement with the review teams, which also leads to more predictability in terms of the company, the innovators, the investors. The other part of the TAP program, and this is where my personal experience is around everything that's not regulatory related. And so we like to work with the companies and ask them about their business plan, their business model, and really help them identify, again, what that path to commercialization will look like, and identify the unknowns or the risks on that path, and then figure out where we can use different resources that we've activated with the TAP program to help them understand those risks and ideally enable them to make plans that will help them get through those risks faster, more expeditiously and whatnot. There's a few different stakeholders that we've engaged in the medical device ecosystem. First, payers and reimbursement subject matter experts. Having a plan for reimbursement as early as possible is critical for success, and we try to get information from the reimbursement community and for our subject matter experts to help companies get better information to inform their plans. Patient organizations, of course, is first and foremost. We work with a variety of different patient organizations, including ABC, American Brain Coalition, who we're partners with in the neurospace, to help companies get input from patients, be it in the early design phase or when preparing for a clinical study and executing a clinical study. That input is invaluable. And then providers, of course, in the form of medical specialty societies. We've engaged with most of the major medical specialty societies in the areas where this program is already, and really connecting innovators with those clinicians in the societies. The support of a medical specialty society is absolutely critical to the successful adoption of a device, whether it's through reimbursement support or guidelines creation, promotion, training, whatever it may be. And the societies are eager to be involved with innovation. So it's a really nice confluence of interest there. So that's sort of my job here as the TAP advisor, is kind of helping companies think through their risks, either regulatory or non-regulatory, and then figuring out how we can get them information and interactivity to help reduce those risks and ideally accelerate that process to getting their devices to patients. The last thing I'll talk through is just an example of some non-regulatory considerations that we talk about related to market adoption and patient access to devices. And there are many, many out there, right? I gave you some. But I want to just kind of talk in a little bit more detail about these business-related items, and just to give you a taste of what these are. And I'll start with value proposition and business model, key business strategic questions that need to be answered. And I listed some here. Clinical practice and the impact of the adoption of a new therapy. Like, how does this change clinical practice? Is it disruptive, and what's the plan to dealing with that disruption? Value proposition. Is there a clear value proposition, clinical and economic, to all the different stakeholders which are going to be related? Not just the clinician, not just the patient, right? insurance company, the hospital administrator, referring physician, all these stakeholders are critical. And then are the incentives to adopt that therapy or diagnostic for all those different stakeholders aligned? Because in many cases, they're not. And a plan needs to be put in place to figure out how to deal with that. Business model, who is the customer? Are you going to sell to a hospital? Are you selling to a physician in their office? Are you selling directly to a patient? These are key strategic questions that aren't always answered early enough. And other aspects around market introduction. So for me, it's kind of the strategic thinking area. Where do you want to take this business strategically? And then the road to get there, the path to get to where you want to go is your comprehensive reimbursement plan. And unfortunately, it is comprehensive and multifaceted and very complicated. Codes are created for outpatient procedures. They're called CPT codes, created by the American Medical Association. Inpatient procedures are DRG codes created by CMS. And those codes enable a device to be used in a procedure and that procedure to be billed and tracked. And there may be codes out there already for your device, or there may not be, right? Or there may be some. And these codes aren't related to just a primary implant. For instance, with a neurostimulator, they're related to all the work that needs to be done before that and all the work that needs to be done after that. It can be very complicated. Coverage, you have a code, great. But insurance companies have to agree to pay for those procedures, right? And what's the mix of the payers for your patient population? Is it mostly Medicare? Is it mostly commercial payers? What's that landscape look like? And what's the clinical evidence plan with an eye towards payers? I'm almost, when I work with my companies, I almost think, I assume this works, and I assume we're going to work through the regulatory challenges, right? But how do we get it paid for? That's actually a critical challenge that we need to address together. And how do we get it paid for by these payers versus those payers? Payment. You've got coding, great. You've got insurance companies are going to pay for it, great. But the payment level going to a hospital or a physician is not sufficient to drive adoption because there are alternative uses of time and resources. Super critical factor in this fee-for-service, U.S. healthcare system. It's critical to think through these as well. Healthcare economics, insurance companies are going to want to see that. Alternative payment models, a lot of our therapies are fee-for-service, but direct to patients or value-based care are additional models that can be considered for certain devices. So, unfortunately, like I said, I wanted to give you a taste of what this landscape looks like, what this post-approval challenges are. You don't need just one or two of these, right? These all need to be answered and all need to be figured out. Strategic plans need to be put in place as early as possible in order to accelerate access to patient access to therapies, basically. And I put this quote in. There was an article in The Atlantic the other day about Neuralink, and the subtitle of the article was, "It turns out that connecting brains with computers is the easy part." And I don't want to downplay the amazing, groundbreaking technical and scientific work being done, but unfortunately, if you build it, they will come is not how this works. But that's why I'm here. That's why we're here with the TAP program. Like I said, we're building a team of different, or maybe I didn't say, we're building a team of different folks from across the medical device industry, ranging from venture capital to FDA expert reviewers to non-smart business people like me. But the whole idea is to get a variety of folks with different experiences across that medical device ecosystem to work with these companies, ultimately to accelerate their path to market and the path for patients to get access to innovation. So I have a few resources as well that you can access. Please feel free to reach out to me. I should say too, I live here. I'm local in Minnesota. I'm the TAP local representative, and I'm here to work with the local medical device community. So thank you very much.
My friends at the FDA, with their presentation, have teed me up pretty well. Because this topic, if you just talk about reimbursement, when I was asked to do it, I was like, hey, what piece of it? How do I approach this? There's so much to talk about. But when we look at it, and someone like myself that's brought into reimbursement from clients, these are some of the things that we ask the questions about. My lens on this is really going to be from a strategic perspective. Because with the technology, we can look at it strategically, and then we look at it for commercialization. What are we going to do? How do we implement everything? But this right now in the thought process of this conference, what we've teed out to talk about today really is in that lens. When I talk to clients, this is what I tell them sometimes. They want to know, they want me to give them answers. I told Tay this should really be the title of the presentation. And sometimes we don't know all the answers. Sometimes we just have to figure it out. And I have a slide that you're going to see soon, just like Rob did, where it's a chessboard. We get an answer on something from FDA, we get an answer from CMS, an application, and we sit there and we go, what next? So in the work that I do, I've had really the privilege, and I feel that way, on some of the devices I've worked on. I've worked on some glioblastoma treatments that are amazing to me because it's a smaller patient population. There's not much that's out there for right now. But I also work for Medtronic, just like Kai did and some of the others of you in this room. That's where I first got my exposure to neuromodulation with InterStem for bladder and incontinence control. From there, I work with the Christopher Reeve Foundation on a consulting basis. That was really a very interesting project to work on. The goal at that time was working on locomotor training. It was remarkable to me. We ended up at CMS just trying to get them to understand that locomotor training is not gait training. CMS basically said you have codes and you have coverage and you have payment. What's the problem? We said because it's not the same. And so that was a very long process and discussion, and even kind of remarkable for the Reeve Foundation, those that were doing clinical studies, to try and understand what data do we need to move on and put together to move the dial on this. I also work with some exoskeleton companies, which is really interesting as well on their strategy to get them to understand, do we just go commercially with this? Do we go to the VA? How long is the runway on reimbursement to actually get patient access if we want to get this through to payers for them to pay for it? So here we are today in the space really talking about reimbursement for neuromodulation. For me, I work on, in reimbursement when companies come to me, on coding, coverage, and payment. Kai mentioned that. I look for a symphony. I want that whole orchestra to be playing beautifully together. I want there to be codes. I want the codes to track to great payment. But to do that, I need coverage. For me, the most challenging thing is always coverage. And that really has to do with mostly clinical data. There are a whole lot of different codes we need to work on for sites of service or for the physicians, like Kai mentioned, under coverage, who are the entities we're going to, what are they saying about the data, and then finally on the payment level, who are the providers, what are the different sites of service. So in reimbursement, when a company comes to me, I talk about a lot of the things that like Kai mentioned. What's your exit strategy? Are you raising money? How long is your runway in terms of resources and time for this? Because it can be pretty long. What we're going to design for reimbursement can be short for certain companies. I've had some that even before they commercialize, they just want to sell their business and let the company that's going to buy them take on the financial burden of running the additional studies. Others want the whole runway. They want to develop new products. It makes a difference. So a big takeaway, I think you're hearing it, start early with understanding the different strategies and application of clinical data for all these vested entities. So a lot of this has been talked about already. If I'm doing an analysis for a company and I'm asked the question, what's the reimbursement pathway look like? I say, let's talk about that. What are you doing with the FDA? What are you looking for indications? What's going on from there based on what you've done with the FDA? Let's talk about codes. Let's talk about if codes exist that you can use. We have to analyze that. Might we need new codes? I don't know. We have to look very deeply in terms of some things we're going to talk about that'll help inform us. When we look at provider adoption, to me, this is such an important discussion. Not just patient interest in it, but provider adoption. They may be looking at different levels of evidence for them to take this on in their clinics. And so we may be working very hard on the reimbursement side for codes for them and coverage and payment, but they're like, this has to be meaningful To me, this has to be something that I want to bring in to my clinic or a center of excellence. Investors in the board, it's a whole nother category. I work with investors. They'll have me do analysis and say, should we put money into this technology? Tell me where the gaps are. Tell me where the hiccups are. I'm getting the marketing story from the company, but I want to know the information in terms of truly the reimbursement landscape. From the board, I get calls sometimes from CEOs that say, someone on our board told me that another company they worked on was successful with this. Why aren't we doing that? And sometimes the answer is because it's not cookie cutter, and just because you're in the same space with maybe something similar, it doesn't mean that pathway, it doesn't mean that code will work for you. So in terms of reimbursement, a couple of slides here really quickly. We've talked about this is just a different way to think about it. The clinical evidence requirements for your vested entities are different. And to this day, having worked in reimbursement for many years, it's remarkable to me that that is new information, particularly for companies that are moving down the road, that are actually have their FDA indication, they're excited, they've done their press releases, and they're like, we are ready to go. Not so, says the payers with coverage. Maybe not so much if they need a new code, if it's a hospital and they need a new code, a HCPCS code, a C code to get that device additional money. So a publication strategy is a really good idea. It's a really good idea for internal conversations between the regulatory people, for your clinical people, for the reimbursement entities that's leading it, and to present to your board and also to the investors. So they are informed, there's power and knowledge around this. We know that if we have a publication strategy, it may not be cast in stone and it can be fluid, but it communicates that you have intelligence around this and you recognize that you have a broad spectrum of entities that need clinical information from you and you're aware of it. Where do you find guidance on how to design a study? Well, the FDA is very communicative with you on that point. But what happens when you're thinking about what did the payers want? What did the payers need? When we do analysis, we look at a lot of different sources. There may not be identical devices out there, but there are what I call kissing cousins. We can get a GPS on maybe what we need to do on clinical study design based on maybe policies that exist. We can get information from there. How detailed of studies you need to put together. Are they interested in clinical settings versus academic? Most of the time, yeah. Randomized control trial, what's your control group look like? These medical policies, for those of you that have never seen them, they are so detailed and so telling in terms of what you might need to put together. So the level of evidence is so important. I have worked with companies where they're like, we have a problem, we don't understand it. We have a category 1 code, which is fascinating to me because their level of evidence was just case series. And they said, we can't get coverage from the payers. I'm like, well, the reason is you only have case series. But we have to think about what do we do in the absence of perfect data. In that case, which was interesting, what we did was put together an advocacy program because they really needed the blues. And we got about 24 blues to approve coverage on just putting together the right KOLs, like key opinion leaders, that were very thoughtful, very well respected, and to have one-to-one conversations with the medical directors because really their technology fit an unmet need that was really important. Can that happen again? And not all the time, but it's something we'll think about if we don't have the right level of evidence. So this is a case study on clinical study design and the importance of it. This particular technology had a category 1 code, but again, they had non-coverage. You look at the volume of their studies, they had over 500. That's a lot. Like, they spent a lot of money on clinical data. They couldn't get covered. If you look at some of the data they had 6 randomized control studies. 3 were single-centered. Some were just academic versus clinical. 2 actually had favorable mention, meaning at the end of the study, the investigators said, this makes sense. We think there's promise here. We think that there's clinical application. But the problem was for the payers that they said, we don't really think in general this demonstrates improved outcomes versus the gold standard. In this case, they wanted to see great outcomes comparatively, and it just was very light on that. So what happened? It was very low provider adoption, and the company had to implement a very aggressive prior authorization and appeal process. That is really expensive for companies to do. I have worked with companies, some of us were talking about this last night, when I provide information to companies on that end of it, companies can spend, when they're starting, depending if it's outsourced or in-house staff, $500,000 to well over $1 million on this initiative just to get the claims through, depending on how you want to do it. Medicare doesn't demand prior authorization, but certain companies do it just to get that information in, so when the claim is denied, because we think it will be denied, that they have the information and we can jump on it. In the space of neuromodulation, there's a lot going on. The one that we look at a lot and maybe we benchmark to, because there's some interesting information out there and very encouraging, is pain relief. When you look at the list of other things that are out there, cochlear implant for me, I have a soft place in my heart for it. I have a nephew that was born deaf. He is bicochlear. Because of that, he has an amazing life. He has a job. If you did not know he was deaf, listening to him is just like speaking as if I'm speaking. When he takes the cochlear implants off, he sounds like somebody that's speaking that is deaf. So these technologies and what they're doing for patients' lives is remarkable. So as we're moving forward in spinal cord innovation in this space, the thought around what are the indications that we're really looking at, what are we trying to do, and being very thoughtful about that so we understand that the data being developed, what we do with that data, the study design, where we publish that data, the conversations that we're having with the FDA early stage are really so important, because some of the technologies in this space that I've worked on, they'll show me the data and I'm like, it's not powered enough. It's interesting, but it's really probably not powered enough. So spending time on this, what your indication is and how you support that clinically is really important. Again, just in pain relief, there's a great model here in poster child. You will find codes, a lot of codes, good codes, CPT codes, C codes for the device, L codes. They have procedure codes, they have diagnosis codes. There's coverage in place. There's great payment that is viable for the physicians, the hospital, inpatient and outpatient. That's really what we're looking to do. That is the symphony that I was talking about earlier. There are also coverage policies, national coverage policies that have been out for quite a while in this space. This is just a snippet. For those of you who have never looked at a coverage policy, in particular Medicare coverage policies, they're pretty dense. I mean, some of it is even dense for us that work in the space, but it's very telling. But you'll find things like you see here, right? They're going to give you criteria. They're going to explain what they want to see, why, when, how, that the technology can be used. That's just on the Medicare side. Then there's the whole private payer side. That can differ. Medicare Advantage plans should follow what Medicare is saying because it's federal dollars and they really are mandated to do that. Non-Medicare Advantage plans, they can have their own criteria. And so you'll always see this language in billing guides from companies that say, please, contact your private payer for guidelines on that. So when we move to coverage and we think about it, and we're thinking about spinal cord injury in the neuromodulation space, what are some things to think about? Well, whether you have policy or not, if they're just submitting a claim, it'll be so interesting to hear from the physician later about how they're getting paid for this and what they are doing. And sometimes they get calls from companies saying, what do you mean we have non-coverage? We have physicians that say they're submitting claims and getting paid. And we're like, let's talk about that. Let's see what codes they're using. Let's see what documentation they're submitting. Is it on-label or off-label? But there's a very long list here, and some of the things that just jump out, we've talked about the level of evidence, how that is so critical, what they're looking for. I have companies that their patient population has very high Medicare age, but they don't have any Medicare age population in the study. And so the payer's like, where are our people? You know, CMS is like, where are our individuals? And so it really was a miss. But above all, they're looking at medical necessity. They like to see the unmet need. The key opinion leader voices and the patient advocacy groups and their voice. In the space, a very interesting thing I saw once in diabetes. Very large patient population in diabetes. They actually didn't have all the criteria, but the patient voice, the advocacy groups were pounding down the door at a very large payer. And the medical director finally called and said, call off the dogs. We will do something about this. So we work very hard in tandem. It was mentioned earlier in the presentation. It's not one thing that can move the dial in coverage, but it's many things that we look at, depending on the technology, depending on the patient population, and strategically, that's what we talk about. Things are never cookie cutter. Thankfully, my friends at the FDA talked about breakthrough designation, why we have an interest in it when we're looking in reimbursement and just getting coding, coverage, and payment, particularly on the payment side. You know, this affects the applications, and I'll talk about that in a minute, the breakthrough designation, why that's really important, how it's helpful. Payer mix consideration is really important for companies. Strategically, we say, what's your target patient population? Why? In general, we know that Medicare and Blue Cross Blue Shield are your top 2 payers in every state. It hasn't changed for a long time and possibly won't. So based on the target patient population, we will sit there and stratify and come up with a plan of who are we going after in terms of payer, what's the most important, which are the most important payers that'll help patient access. And it varies differently sometimes within the same space. But what's interesting is sometimes we'll say, your low-hanging fruit here really, while we're working on with the CMS and the private payers, is Kaiser or the VA. Or the administrative services only, because it's their money and they make decisions on how claims are paid. So there's different pathways, and we can work with, and Geisinger is a great example, these accountable care organizations that exist. So it's important to understand this and make this a part of the strategy and think about, when you're putting data together, what these entities are looking for. Very quickly, in neuromodulation in general for chronic pain, these are just to sensitize you and give you examples. These are not all the CPT codes, these are some of them. Far left, here's your code. What's the code describing? And then far right, national payment. For, in this case, the physician, what you will see is in office and out of office. I've worked on technologies where the adoption happened from the physician when we moved the technology, the coverage and payment from inpatient to outpatient to ASC to the office. Depending on the technology, that is very important to some providers. They want to be able to control the setting and the patient if it's something that's appropriate and can be done in their office setting. So working on getting that office reimbursement on a robust level, because they're acquiring the technology, is really important. So that's what we see here in neuromodulation for pain. Again, here you'll see that payments are very robust and in place, DRGs on the hospital side. And for the ASCs, depending on the technology, you have a lot of physicians that are vested in these ASCs, and that's their preferred site of service. So coding considerations, I think this was mentioned earlier. A code doesn't guarantee coverage. I talked about that earlier. Companies will come and say, we need a code, we need a code, we need a code. And I'm like, why do you want a code? Other than the obvious reasons. Oh, because we'll get coverage. It's not the case. So we will do assessments. Are existing codes viable for you or not? Do you need a new code? Sometimes it's a combination. Sometimes there's existing codes for the physician for CPT codes, but this technology, it needs additional payment. It'll need a HCPCS code. We have to get them a C code. Where do we look for intelligence around it? We look at several things, but we want validation from other entities. You know, medical societies get mentioned a lot. The AMA can give input as well. We want to know that as a company, we communicate to them. We want to validate these sources. So when you're talking to investors, when you're talking to the board, where did we get this intelligence that this is the path where you're going to go down in terms of codes? Payment considerations. Well, on the physician side, you know, they're the first point of contact for the patient. If they are not happy with their reimbursement, they may not want to do the procedure, even though we have pretty robust reimbursement on the facility side. A couple of things, if we need new payment or increased payment on the device, there are mechanisms in place. You see 3 of them right here: outpatient, inpatient, 2 for the outpatient, 1 for inpatient. And this is where the device breakthrough designation comes into play. When we have it on a technology, it helps us kind of move through quickly the requirement for significant clinical improvement. So we worked on a technology where actually right now IEM, this is where the chest game comes into place. We sent in an application for outpatient new tech. They were denied. And so now we're working on what do we do now. We're working with the societies. We're working the KOL advocacy. We just had a meeting with CMS. They said, we still don't see it. We said, okay, back to the chessboard. But this is real life. This is how reimbursement works. And that's why these timelines, you need to be very fluid with them. You need to understand that they're going to change, and they will change, but have sensitivity around, you know, what you're thinking about, what you're communicating to your investors, to the board, to your company, the people within the company, and then make sure all of you are communicating together. I'm happy afterwards, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I'm very passionate about reimbursement, even though sometimes people say it's like they'd rather have hot pokers in their eyes than deal with it. But thank you.
So I'm going to get started. Yeah, I love how we've just been building on each other's talk. So maybe I don't even need to talk at all, because we've really emphasized the key perspectives here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do at Praxis and how it relates to what we want to talk today, which is how do we integrate? How do we start integrating these perspectives on regulatory reimbursement, and then as a community organization, which Praxis is, how do we play a role in all of that? Our bios will be our disclosure slide. So like Kai, I always say I'm not a clinician, I'm not an engineer, but luckily I've worked in the medical device and healthcare space for over 10 years. And the one area that I've spent quite a bit of time is working in the public system, so both at the ministry level and the hospital level. So seeing how is the sausage made? How does, in this case, Canadian government make some decisions? I'm joined with my amazing team members who you've heard talk and will hear talk later today. So you've seen this valleys of death slide in a number of different iterations in the presentation, which is awesome because I think repetition breeds memory. What we do at Praxis, we are a charitable organization, as I mentioned. We're funded by Government of Canada. Is we look at how can we shorten that timeline, because as you heard from Rob, timing is key. So we have a number of programs that anyone in this room could apply for, hitting these specific valleys of death. So when you're just prototyping a design, and then when you're also looking at a little bit of later stage development. What I want to emphasize is the stuff on the right. How do we do it? There's a lot of accelerators. The core of what we do is we bring people with lived experience with spinal cord injury. So pardon me, I'm going to use the word plex instead of patient, just because we feel people in the community have a lot to contribute, but they're not sitting in a hospital all day. So plex individuals actually are the coaches for our companies. And why is this important? Well, I always use the analogy of a dating app. If I wanted to ask each of your perspectives on this dating app I've created, I can walk up to you and say, what do you think of this dating app, right? You may choose not to answer. But if I'm asking someone, explain to me your journey, like Rob so generously did, explain to me your bladder and bowel routine, that's not something I can just go up to you and do that. So how do we make an agile product experience in a space of trust where people are being respected? But how can it be that a device developer can ask my colleague John, every day. Hey, John, does this button work? Hey, John, do you actually want this feature, or is it just noise? And if we can do that, can we shorten the product market fit? The other thing we really do, even at the very early stage, is bring discussions around regulatory and reimbursement, both US and Canada. Why do we do this? So I had a few innovators say, Arushi, this is too early to talk about reimbursement. Let people be creative. And I say, engineers are some of the most creative people I know. And if you give them constraints, they will design around the constraints. So why don't you give them, here's this complicated world that Lynn just kind of, that she sort of opened up and said, this is complicated. Why don't we tell our biomedical engineers, this is how complicated it is? Sometimes I interview engineers who are in our programs and said, are you ready for a 10-year journey on this? And they go, and a lot of them are, because they have that passion. So I actually don't see these constraints as don't do it. It's actually educating and supporting our innovators to be 10 times as successful. So we had that hypothesis. We knew it was the right thing to bring people with lived experience to actually coach a company. So just for perspective, our people with lived experience, folks like Rob, are coaching the companies 20 to 50 hours one-on-one. This has yielded results. So we put less than $1 million, around $1 million in grants. We only started in 2020. It's actually a higher number. The companies went ahead and raised over $100 million. 9 products are in market. Those 9 products are aligned to the priorities of people with spinal cord injury. So it's a small signal, but it's a positive one. These are some of the companies we've supported. Each and every one of them, people with spinal cord injury were involved in their selection and coaching. And those are some of the companies that their products are in market, a lot of them in the US, actually. So I want to talk a little bit about what is that vision for neuromodulation, reimbursement access, and reimbursement? What's the big picture? And I want to really caveat this is not set in stone. This is an emerging conversation. So a lot of what I'm presenting is illustrative. I want your feedback. Please plug in. Please disagree. Let's sort of build on each other's thinking. So some of the things we hear over and over again in the last 5 years I've been at Praxis is people with spinal cord injury want early access to neuromodulation therapies. There's complexity in that, but that is what they're looking at. There's an opportunity to optimize recovery through that. There's a research question, and there's a safety consideration, definitely. People want access at home. So a number of you listening to the sessions, you've heard that. People want access at home, on demand. What we've heard over and over, and the way we like to characterize it, is access to epidural and transcutaneous stim is a continuum of care. So you've also heard every spinal cord injury is different. So how can we just plug and play one technology to such a diverse population? We can't. That doesn't mean we don't do anything. It just means we have a really tailored approach and working with clinicians to say, oh, this is your level of injury, what works best for you? Where do we place those electrodes? And then last but not least, people want support and maintenance throughout their lifetimes. There have been some heartbreaking stories of people who've had implants and have just been too far away to actually get access to optimization or just maintenance of their device, and that's really important. So what is that vision for neuromodulation regulatory access? So I think there was some really great discussion. Heather alluded to that. There's some mechanisms for people with lived experience to advocate for measures that mean something to them, right? Measures that actually matter. And so, sometimes we feel what people with lived experience, what clinicians, and what our regulators and payers want are very different. And I think that sometimes is the case, but sometimes you have a sweet spot, and I'll be talking about that. The other thing, which I think we're alluding to, is people with spinal cord injury want expanded labels for existing devices, right? They want to be able to get help now, and there may be certain devices that were optimized for pain or other conditions, but you know what? They can save lives today. That's the reality. A lot of times in chronic spinal cord injury, people don't think by putting an intervention now, you're not saving lives. You are. You're saving lives. People want safety, safety in these devices, right? So some of the survey data we had, and that's exactly why regulators like the FDA exist, that people want safety. They don't want to lose function and have additional pain with what they already have already. Another big theme that I heard in the last 3 days is spasticity. People don't want to trade increased spasticity long term. So my wonderful colleagues at Praxis did an incredible survey asking the Plex community what are their perceptions of spinal cord stimulation. And I think some folks presented some of this data earlier. So when I look at that data, that there's a majority of individuals who want to try both modalities with kind of a little bit of a expanded interest in transcutaneous stim because it's non-invasive, that's a very high number in medical device adoption. That's much higher than I expect. So obviously there's a self-selection bias where people who are answering our surveys are engaged, they're involved, but that's still exciting data. But what I'm more interested in is this 40%. That's pulled, is that the 40% of those respondents said they were not very informed of the technology. And then 20% said they were not very interested in the technology. There's a 2024 paper that evaluated online resources of how are we educating people what is neuromodulation. Before this presentation, I tried to Google neuromodulation as if I didn't know any of these organizations. I couldn't find anything, and I couldn't find anything credible. And the conclusions of this paper was that our findings suggest that the public may be exposed to incomplete or dated information from unidentifiable sources that can put consumers at risk. Again, I don't think this is a negative. This is not don't do it. I think there's an opportunity here. So the other thing that the survey did is really try to unpack what are the priorities of people with lived experience, and how do we then look at how does that map into spinal cord stimulation. So upper extremity and fine motor skills, key metric, standing and walking, key metric, bladder and bowel function, particularly for people with complete paraplegia. Overall, people want improved functional independence. But here's the thing that I always get told by the spinal cord injury community is we're not trading off functions with each other. This is an integrated body and system. And I really like this quote. If you've got working hands, you can sort of deal with your own bladder and bowel. But without functioning hands, you're pre-dependent on other people for everything. So let's, while these priorities are important, always think of the functional system of the body. So what did that map into in terms of, again, I'm not an outcome measures expert, but I work very closely with several, is can these key priorities be measured in some imperfect way or perfect way through outcome measures we have? The answer is yes, to some degree, right? We have measures across these priorities. Now, what's really interesting to me is when we look at some of these measures, like bladder and bowel, we look at incontinence, UTI, hospitalizations, and what the survey unpacked, and sorry, this is really fine, is these are people with lived experience, their perspective on what is meaningful, what would drive them to adopt spinal cord stimulation therapy. And what astounded me was how clearly it mapped into economic benefit. People wanted to perform their bladder and bowel care independently. People wanted to have less reliance on caregivers. Caregivers will still be an integral part of what we do, but you know what? If you can have an hour or two where you're not dependent on care, when you have a bit more privacy, that's huge. People want mobility. People want to return to work. Now, this is not a surprise to the spinal cord injury community, but there's been some conversation we've had before where people don't think people with disabilities want to participate. They want to participate in work, and most are not able to. And then people want to reduce fatigue, and they want to increase their energy. So let's look at that SCI priority. We heard some of those key benefits and priorities of people with spinal cord injury. Then let's look at some potential outcome measures, right? And these are not the right ones. I think this is a really illustrative framework. But let's see how we can map them into economic benefit. So could we see with an improvement in upper extremity function, a reduction in caregiver hours? Could we see a long time improvement in functional independence hitting some of these other targets? Could we see a reduction in hospitalizations due to improved continence and reduced UTIs? Now, what I want you to look at in those targets is those are targets. That's not set in stone. But shouldn't we be working towards some type of economic benefit if we want to make sure that payers and providers are at least looking at this and looking at the return on investment? And my answer is yes. So I've kind of taken an opposite of a research approach. We've looked at these targets. So we've done a very rough economic sensitivity analysis based on transcutaneous stim. And caregiver hours were one of the big dominant factors. We didn't have enough data on hospitalization to know where the base case would be. And we saw that a 10 to 15% reduction in caregiver hours, which is 1 hour maybe a day or 2, could almost see a return on investment on some types of transcutaneous therapies between 3 and 5 years. Now, why is that important? Well, hold that thought. Before I go really into the economic benefit side, I want to really emphasize that there are data gaps that we don't know of. If any of you know of these data gaps, please come to me and fill my knowledge gaps and our organization's knowledge gaps. But do we have a linkage in improvements in functional gains and caregiver hours? Not exactly from what we've seen, right? There's been there's an older study on a FIM measure and caregiver hours and how that maps into how many caregiver hours you use, but we don't have anything for the therapy. Do we have a linkage of the SCS therapy and reduction in hospitalizations? Not exactly either. We've seen in pain, as we've referred to as a good, it's not exact, but it's a good analogy. In pain, there was a 2004 study where people self-reported over 200 participants, and they saw a huge reduction in hospitalizations and a huge reduction in dependence on caregiver hours. Is there a linkage between therapy and reduction in fatigue? So there's a preprint here that's in the citation that actually says there is a linkage, but it's only N of 1 or 2, right? So is that something we can dig into and actually map that into reduction in fatigue means return to work potential? Again, it's not that simplistic, but can we do that? Is there a linkage, as my colleague John says, between SCS therapy and pressure injury incidents? If there is, you're saving lives. And then, the topic that kept coming up is how are we standardizing outcome measures enough so that we're not replicating the same studies? We can go, oh, you found some return to work data or caregiver hour data. Can I take your data from America? Or can I take your data from the NHS and plug it into my system in Canada? And having worked for the Canadian system, you know what I used to do? They used to ask, what are they doing in the UK and Australia? Show me the best practices there. That's what I was doing for government, right? So it's not like we don't look at other countries to try and piggyback. Again, that's not the answer that you're going to get paid. I don't want to say that, but that's a step, one of the data pieces we really need to think about. Let's consider the cost investment barrier. Obviously, we talked about a vision. We want access. There's a cost of the upfront device. Now, this is going to, I think, this was referred to earlier by Dr. Dennison, is the cost of the device up front, right? Even in our systems in North America, they're hard to rationalize, between, say, 30 to 40,000 or 100,000. What about India? What about South Africa? Both countries I'm from. What's the cost to supervise this therapy if it's at home? What's the payback? And so one thing we want to really emphasize is some of those private payers are looking for a 3-year payback or a 5-year payback. They want to know, I put this device in and I'm going to return my investment in 3 to 5 years. Is that right? I'm not here to talk about morality. I'm here to talk about constraints we need to think about. And then public funders, the ones that we work for in Canada, this is I don't know if it's the ugly truth, but it's the reality. They're considering adopting any intervention you're doing in spinal cord injury against a global envelope. That means they're going, should I put this money in spinal cord injury, or should I put it in reducing surgical wait lists, or should I put it in cancer? And that sucks, but that's actually what we've seen happen at the provincial level. So what are some potential activities that we can come together as a community? And this is, again, not set in stone. I'm really looking for your feedback and interaction. What we really want to do is channel energy so we're not duplicating efforts and we're working together in this access piece. So the first is building evidence to improve, potentially, return to work and caregiver alliance, using some of the measures that we've kind of highlighted. They may not be the right ones. They may be others. But who can we get, or who is willing to contribute to this research work, which might be some of the most important research work to actually get stuff paid for. Now, let's learn about early adoption sites and clinical champions. As was referred to before, clinical champions are really key for economic feasibilities. And how do we communicate those benefits? So this is from the Canadian health system, and it's messy, and most of you can't read it. That's intentional, because it's complicated, as we keep saying over and over. Each of these levels, all the way from the hospital administrator, they're going to ask for specific data set, right? And in America, I believe you have VAC committees, VAC committees. We here have HTA kind of assessments at the hospital level, where each hospital, you have a device, you say, we have a code, and they're like, but we don't want just adopt it. We're going to evaluate independently from not just a clinical benefit perspective, but economic benefit of whether we can afford it. And that layers up provincially, all the way between regional health, provincial, and then there's our regulators. And while this is different in every country, some of those things actually echo. And what's really important to realize, and I've gone through a process where we're going through 2 layers of this pair, is each of these stakeholders are going to ask for a different type of data in a different format at a different time with a different purpose. But there's a synchronicity of looking at the economic benefit alongside the clinical benefit. And so the format part I want to emphasize, because I've been in that place where I've formatted the data differently to fit the need of a hospital versus a private insurer. You have to format it. If you give them data in a way they don't understand, you're just making it hard for yourself long term. Now, on the education piece, how can we disseminate and coordinate education resources for people with lived experience, caregivers, and clinicians to drive access and adoption? If they don't know about this therapy and how to use it effectively, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And I really like this quote from a person with lived experience saying, explain it to me like I'm 5 years old, or a caregiver. You need to explain things in a person-to-person way, not professional to person. And there's some really great starting resources here. NAS, Kick, and SCAR, they have small sections on neuromodulation, but this is a gap that we can work together on. We need to bring an economics-based case to reimbursement providers, healthcare administrators, and other people on that layered piece, right? And we need to start disseminating that information. We need to align with the SCI community to amplify the benefits of neuromodulation to payers and regulatory. And there's been some great work on the regulatory side in highlighting that in the community piece. But I would agree, I think that we need to start engaging, even though we don't have all the data, on the economic benefit. Even if we don't have all the data, we need to start doing that. And there's a complexity in that, but I think there's a huge potential of engaging with physicians and other interest groups and saying, this data's coming, here's the potential, here's some estimates. Can we talk to you in 6 months? If we don't, we shoot ourselves in the foot, because by the time we have all that data, it's another few years to coverage, if coverage even happens, right? So a big thank you for the warm welcome from the university. And again, an acknowledgement I wanted to make that I did this talk on the traditional homeland of the Dakota people. So big thank you.
Thank you guys for a wonderful session. I apologize to everybody who came here for a real scientific conference, and it's been a little bit different than it has been in the past. And I think it's really important for us to understand, as scientists, the whole pathway, right? So this is what we're getting at here. And the data that we're taking and how we present it is going to directly affect how we get through the FDA and how we get reimbursement in the end. So our science is the one that's going to drive all that. So it's really important that we know the entire scope of how this is, because this is the room that's going to get all of this translated and into those patients. So we have a huge responsibility, and it's a huge, long pathway. And I know most of us are not trained in the whole pathway. So that's our goal here. So thank you guys for educating us. Really appreciate it.